The murder of Maria Yvonne Laenen, the family story. The facts of the cold case of the murder of Maria Yvonne Laenen on or about the 28th of January 1978 at Acacia Ridge, Brisbane, Queensland, Australia, are as follows. At approximately 4:20 p.m. on the 29th of January 1978, the body of Maria Yvonne Laenen was found in the boot of her Datsun Sedan, which was parked outside the premises situated at No. 7 Limerick Street, Acacia Ridge. The post-mortem examination indicated that Ms. Laenen's death resulted from vagal inhibition and injury to her larynx. I have previously documented this case in the video Cold Case, the murder of Maria Yvonne Laenen. To view this video, click on the suggested video link on the top of the screen. This video, however, documents the Laenens family story about the day Maria went missing and was later discovered murdered. The following is an account of the sworn statement of Louis Laenen, Maria's father, to the Acacia Ridge Police on the 28th of January 1978. These are the facts as happened between Saturday 28th of January and Sunday 29th of January 1978. Maria, referred to throughout her father's statement as Mary, was 22 years old at the time, left her home between 3 and 3:30 p.m. on Saturday 28th of January 1978. It has been alleged that the Woodridge Police incorrectly recorded these details, stating in the official police report that Maria left home at midday. Maria's parents stated that she never stayed out after midnight, without letting them know where she was staying and what time she would be coming home. In fact, all of Maria's siblings had always done the same up until the day they got married, and all of Maria's friends knew her to have always done this. On Saturday, the 28th of January, Maria's parents went to bed at approximately 10:30 p.m. Mr. Laenen stated, quote, "As I woke up on Sunday morning at 7 a.m., I was very surprised to find Mary's room unoccupied. I asked my wife if Mary had telephoned. When my wife told me that she hadn't heard anything, we thought at first that we hadn't heard the telephone. We were at that time quite certain that she would be home before 8 a.m, or otherwise let us know her whereabouts, as this was her normal way of doing," end quote. At 8 o'clock a.m, when Maria still had not returned home or telephoned her parents began to panic and began telephoning everyone they thought Maria may have stayed with overnight, but no one they called had seen or heard from Maria. Mr. Laenen said, quote, "I intended to telephone the Woodridge Police, but my neighbour, Mr. J. Ruthenberg, who had come to join us, at that time we were already very upset, suggested to go to the police station immediately," end quote. Just prior to 10 o'clock a.m, Maria's parents and Mr. Ruthenberg arrived at the Woodridge police station. They distinctly remembered the time they arrived, as they recalled that at that time there was another woman at the police station making a complaint about a group of children and some young adults reporting a car accident. Mr. Laenen maintains that this was the second fact that Woodridge Police had incorrectly recorded on the official report, and that it was impossible that they had arrived at the police station after 10:15 a.m, let alone that they were there at 11:30 a.m, which Constable in Charge Riley claims in his official report. By 11:30 a.m, Mr. and Mrs. Laenen and Mr. Ruthenberg had returned to the Laenen residence and had been there for approximately an hour prior. Mr. Laenen recalls, quote, "We spoke to a policeman whose name we don't know, but we remember he has some tattoo marks on his arms. We told him our great concern about our daughter and her habit to let us know if she for some reason would stay out overnight. We tried to convince him that something was terribly wrong, but we got the impression that he was not very convinced about the importance of our concern." End quote. Mr. Laenen stated that at no time did the police officer mention that he could not understand what Mr. Laenen was saying due to his accent. In addition to this, Mr. Rothenberg, who is an Australian, was present and could have assisted in interpreting for Mr. Laenen. Mr. Laenen added, quote, "For nearly 20 years we are living in this country, and for 15 years I worked in the hotel business, and never did I meet somebody who told me that he could not understand me. Despite the fact that he was not very convinced, he let me fill a missing person form and accepted a photo of our Mary. He then told us the police would start an investigation." End quote. Mr. Laenen was outraged at the lack of response from the Woodridge police, stating, quote, "And if what we told the Woodridge police is not a conclusive reason for our suspicion, then I don't know what is." End quote. The Laenen family were terribly concerned about the lack of police assistance and brought it upon themselves to investigate Maria's disappearance. Mr. Laenen described the family's efforts in search of Maria. Quote, "This was the reason that we decided to start our own investigation. Our daughters, Josie Maciejewicz and Elizabeth Rietveld, started looking at Compton Road, Beanley Road and surroundings, but they came back at about noon without any success. I was still trying to get people on the phone who could possibly know something. At about 1 p.m, I got in contact with Mary's old boyfriend, Terry Gallagher. He told me that Mary on Saturday evening had given somebody a lift home to Coley Street, Acacia Ridge. My son-in-law, Mr. Robert Rietveld, his wife Elizabeth, and my wife decided to go to Acacia Ridge, where my daughter Elizabeth spoke with the mother of the boy Mary had given a lift, and she told her that Mary had driven on after letting her son off." End quote. Shortly after this, while driving around the suburb of Acacia Ridge, Maria's mother, Maria's sister Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's husband located Maria's vehicle, her Datsun Sedan, on Limerick Street, opposite house number 7. At approximately 1:45 p.m, Mr. Laenen received a phone call from his daughter Elizabeth, informing him that they had located Maria's vehicle, but there was still no sign of Maria. Mr. Laenen told Elizabeth to stay with the vehicle and wait for the police to arrive, and to be careful not to touch anything. Mr. Laenen continues, quote, "I then telephoned the Woodridge police for the first time at about 2 p.m. I spoke to a policeman who told me he was not the same person to whom we had reported Mary as a missing person. I then informed him that Mary's car had been located in Limerick Street, Acacia Ridge. He asked if I could spell Limerick Street. I told him I didn't know, but there was only one Limerick Street in Acacia Ridge. He promised me that he would start an investigation." End quote. At approximately 3:40 p.m, Mrs. M. Smith, Elizabeth Rietveld's neighbour, arrived at Limerick Street and drove Mrs. Laenen home as she was getting increasingly distressed and worried. They left Limerick Street at approximately 3:50 p.m. Shortly after this, Elizabeth telephoned her father again and asked, quote, "What is happening, Dad? The police has not been here yet." End quote. After hearing this, Mr. Laenen immediately telephoned the Woodridge police for the second time in the presence of Mr. M. Whitby, another neighbour of the Laenens. The following is a record of the conversation between Mr. Laenen and the Woodridge police. Mr. Laenen, quote, "Why for heaven's sake has nobody gone to Limerick Street to investigate my daughter Mary's whereabouts?" Police officer, quote, "Mr. Laenen, we have done some investigation ourselves and we have found out that your daughter Mary was having a good time last night at the Sunnybank Motel. I advise you to go and take her car home. She will turn up later. At this moment, she is somewhere having a good time." End quote. Mr. Laenen's response was one of disbelief. He stated, quote, "I thought that I got a heart attack. I started screaming in the telephone so loud that my neighbour, Mr. Whitby, who was standing next to me, took a step backwards. I told the police what I thought about him." The police officer allegedly informed Mr. Laenen that Acacia Ridge was not in their jurisdiction. Mr. Laenen asked why they had not reported the case to the CIB. The officer then replied that they would do everything possible. Immediately after this conversation, Mr. Whitby telephoned the CIB, who informed him that they would ensure Acacia Ridge police would attend the Laenen's residence approximately 30 minutes later. Prior to the Acacia Ridge police arrival at the Laenen residence, Mrs. Laenen and Mrs. Smith had returned to the Laenen residence. When Acacia Ridge police officers arrived, they asked Mrs. Laenen, Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's husband to attend the station to make a formal statement. At this stage, back at the Laenen residence, Mrs. Smith suggested looking in the boot of Maria's vehicle for possible clues. Mr. Laenen and Mr. Whitby's wife, Mrs. E. Whitby, then travelled to Limerick Street to search for clues in Maria's vehicle. They arrived at Limerick Street, and at approximately 4:30 p.m, Mr. Laenen opened the boot of Mary's vehicle. Mr. Laenen recalls, quote, "I got the most horrible shock of my life, and which I can never forget, my dear child dead and naked body. Something in my head broke down and I started screaming. That bastard told me to take that car home. I was running up and down Limerick Street screaming the same words over and over when police started to arrive. A plainclothes policeman ordered 2 constables to put me in a police car. For the first time in my life, I started feeling like being arrested. After a while, I got a hold of myself, and leaving the police car, I told some policeman who approached me not to try to touch me again. He left me alone and somebody gave me a glass of water. After a while, another plainclothes policeman asked me to go with him to Acacia Ridge Police Station to make a statement." End quote. When the detective at Acacia Ridge Police Station, who took Mr. Laenen's official statement on the 29th of January 1978, asked Mr. Laenen to sign it, it was brought to Mr. Laenen's attention that the detective had allegedly, quote, forgotten to write down, quote, certain parts of the statement. Mr. Laenen refused to sign the incomplete statement and demanded the omitted parts be inserted, which included the statement, quote, "This is what really happened on the 28th and 29th of January 1978. And to give you an assurance that this is the truth, everybody who is mentioned in this statement were with us the whole day on Sunday, the 29th of January." End quote. Mr. Matyusevich, Mr. Marion Whitby, Mrs. Elaine Whitby, Mr. J. Ruthenberg, Mrs. M. Ruthenberg, Mr. R. Rietveld, Mrs. E. Rietveld, and Mrs. M. Smith signed the statement. Quote, "We, the undersigned, testify that the contents of this statement, written by Mr. Louis Laenen about what happened in the case of his daughter Mary's disappearance, is the truth." Dated 20th of March, 1978. Woodridge, Brisbane, Queensland.